Hello, and welcome back to Extraordinary Connection. My name is Robert Blanchard, and I'm the pastor here at Lansing First United Methodist Church. And at Lansing First, we're currently studying the book of 1st and 2nd Kings in our Bible study. So today, I would like to share some thoughts with you from a conversation that we had last Thursday. But first, to understand the conversation, if you'll bear with me for a minute, I want to read from a few different verses to give you a sense of how the scriptures describe the adornments of the Temple of Solomon. So I'll be beginning in 1 Kings chapter 6 at verse 20 and reading a few verses from throughout chapter 6 and 7. The interior of the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the altar with cedar. Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. Then he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. Next, he overlaid the whole house with gold, in order that the whole house might be perfect, even the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary he overlaid with gold. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. He covered the 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold, and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of the one, and a cord of 12 cubits would encircle it. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. Then he made the molten sea. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high. A line of 30 cubits would encircle it completely. He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. He made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each basin measured 4 cubits. There was a basin for each of the 10 stands. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. All these vessels that Hiram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. That is an extraordinary amount of precious metal that went into the building of the temple. And yes, even though we don't really think of bronze as a precious metal today, it would have been expensive to obtain and craft in that time, especially in the quantities that we just heard described. The opulent use of these metals led our conversation in an interesting direction. There was a lot of indignation about the idea that the temple would need to be so finely adorned. Why use all that gold to plate the doors and the floors and the chains? Why use all that bronze on basins and stands, pots and shovels? Couldn't there have been a better way to put that to use? And in some regard, I think those questions that were raised were fair. If we read the history of ancient Judah through the eyes of the prophets, rather than the eyes of the priests or the kings, we see a kingdom that is not filled with glory and wealth, but with hunger and poverty. But I didn't want us to stop there. I didn't want to simply leave the conversation at the point of looking down on the temple and the priests, because I think that there is a positive value expressed through the grandiose nature of the temple, even if it's a value that is imperfectly expressed. So I pushed us to try and consider what that value might be. The answer that we were able to find to that question was that in using all this gold and all this bronze in the creation of the temple, they were signifying how important the worship of God was for them. Imagine how much trade could have been generated with the gold that was instead put on floors and doors. Imagine How many craftsmen's tools could have been constructed with the oceans of bronze that went into pillars and basins and pots and shovels and everything else intended for ritual use? If it was simply a matter of pragmatism, then the answer is a resounding yes, that there could have been better use for all that metal. But our worship of God isn't simply a matter of pragmatism. It is, for one thing, also an expression of beauty. The temple was designed in such a way that one was meant to feel as if they were transported up into the heavens before the throne of God upon entering into it. It was meant to be a reflection of the beauty of heaven brought to life here on earth. Do we put such careful thought into our own worship spaces? When we walk into a house of worship, do we feel as though we are stepping out of the ordinary spaces of our daily life and into the kingdom of God? And our worship is also a matter of redirecting our focus away from ourselves and toward God. Much has been said about worship and the right way to do it, and often these questions focus on the form of our worship. Indeed, often the focus is centered on our own subjective response to worship. We walk out of a church on Sunday, and the question that we might hear from friends or family was, "So how was church today?" The meaning behind the question often being, "Did you have a good time at church today?" Conversations about worship rarely ask the question, "Did you offer something pleasing to the Lord this morning?" Because we're too busy asking what we got out of worship. Our own emotions and desires become the object of worship rather than the glory of the Lord. So in the construction of the temple, the focus was not simply pragmatic because it was focused on providing an offering that was pleasing to the Lord. Sure, the gold and the bronze could have been used for political or economic gain or even artistic gain, but it was more important to sacrifice those metals for the worship of God. When we compare the construction of the temple to the way that we approach worship, I think that we could learn to ask more often, what do I hold precious that I am willing to give up in the worship of God? Now, as I already said, I think some of the questions about how those precious resources were used are fair. The king and the priests had so much to offer to the construction of the temple because the entire kingdom was built on a system of uneven distribution. While the temple was lavishly adorned, there were throughout the kingdom widows and orphans with nowhere to live and no food to eat. So even as we seek to find the positive value in the way that the temple elevated worship, we must hold that intention with questions about justice. We need to ask ourselves where our own use of abundance in worship is taking food out of the mouths of the hungry around us. These are just a few of the thoughts that I've been dwelling on in response to our conversation the other night. I would love to hear what thoughts you might have, and I look forward to being with you again next time here on Extraordinary Connection.